All right, so today we're going to be learning the technique of glazing. And when you're glazing, you're creating a glaze, which is a transparent layer of paint, right? Transparent means see-through, right? Now, because we're using acrylic paint, you could make your paint see-through the same way you create your washes when you tone your canvases and just add a ton of water, right? Because then you'll have transparent paint that then you can apply, and whatever is underneath that you will see through. But if you were doing oil paint, that wouldn't work, and you wouldn't just add like a bunch of turpentine, right, to your paint. So what would you do? You would have to add a medium, which would be oil-based if it was oil. But we're using water-based paint. So we can use water or we can use some kind of acrylic medium, right? So mine is in a tube. This one, it says acrylic uh, medium. This one is matte. The one that you have does say matte. Matte means it is not going to make it shiny. They do sell uh, gloss medium, where if you add it to your paint, not only is it going to make it more transparent, but it's going to make your paint when it dries glossy, right? And so painters have different reasons for wanting different things. We don't want to change the shininess of our paint. Our paint is matte, so we're going to use matte medium. I also have another one from Golden here, right? Matte medium. They come in different thicknesses. The one that you have is fairly thick. This one in here is pretty thin, but usually if it's in a jar like this, it's going to be thin, but if it's in like a jug, more like kind of like that, it would be, or in a tube, it'll be a little thicker. Um, Matte medium is also great in painting to be used for as glue. So if you want to attach something to your canvas, if you're doing something mixed media, you can use that and it'll dry and it'll really stick well to your acrylic paint and your canvas as well. So that's another thing you can do with it. Another thing that you could do with it, if you wanted a straight edge, you can put a piece of your blue tape down and then you can put acrylic medium over the edge. I've done this in my own house while doing my molding, right? It's like when you're painting your molding, you put your blue tape down and then you paint it and you think it's going to be perfect, but then it's kind of uneven because some of the paint went through the tape. What you could do, right, is put matte medium over the tape to the wall, or in your painting if you were doing like an abstraction where you wanted this really crisp hard edge. And what it does is it seals between the surface and the tape. So, and then when it dries and it dries clear, nothing can get behind the tape, right? And then you pull up the tape and it'd be a nice perfect straight line. So that's just a little bit about acrylic medium. Okay, so we're going to be using glazing for a transparent layer of paint. So I mentioned this in some of your paintings today, where if you've done a lot of work, right, and you got a lot of detail, but then the whole area perhaps is too light, you can mix up a transparent glaze that's very transparent and add a transparent paint that's darker. And then you thin it out with either your medium or your water. Say this was the area in your painting. Maybe you had like a striped wall, but then there was a big shadow over it. Well, you could create the shadow with a dark glaze over it. So then you still see all these stripes, but then maybe your glaze is a cool neutral, so then it'll get darker and it'll also get cooler, right? So you can adjust large areas so that there's a large shift or a transition, a much smoother transition between areas. So maybe there's too much contrast. Well, put a darker layer, it'll darken it all, lower the contrast also. So some rules that you need to know for creating glaze is you can't do this with all your paints. You cannot create a glaze with your white paint. It'll be milky, and you don't want a glaze to be milky looking. You want it to look like stained glass, right? The clear kind of stained glass, not the milky kind, because you can't see through it. And the whole point of a glaze is so you can see through it. So some of your paints are going to be more opaque. You cannot see through it. Some are going to be very transparent, like your alizarin crimson in your painting kit. You're going to see when you use it. Um, it's pretty see-through. Right, so different paint has different opacities. So usually it says it on your tubes of paint. Like I have a different paint here, and under here it's hard to see because there's paint on it, but it says opaque. Where my blue tube of paint here says translucent. Translucent means it's semi-transparent. Some of your tubes of paint will have like a scale, and they'll show you on the scale how opaque or transparent it is. Now, luckily, in the palette that we're using, both your burnt sienna and your ultramarine are semi-transparent. Your white is not, which means you can use glazes with your burnt sienna, your ultramarine, or by mixing those two together. What does that mean? It means you can create black glazes, you can create orange glazes, neutral orange glazes, blue glazes, and neutral blue glazes, if you would like. So when would you use an orange glaze? Well, if you want to warm up an area. When would you use a blue glaze? If you want to cool an area. When we use a black glaze? When you want to darken an area. Or perhaps you want to use a neutral blue to make it darker and cooler. Or maybe you want to make it a little darker and a little warmer, neutral orange. Now you want your glazes to be really, really thin, right? So the first rule is transparent paint. And you want your glazes to be very thin. Little pigment, more medium, right? So your acrylic paint is made with like this medium with pigment added. So what we're doing is we're adding more medium so it lessens the amount of pigment um, and opacity. Okay, so what will this look like, right? So we did stripes. We did all in the medium value. So we added white to all of them. These are not glazes. This is what we're going to glaze on top of. So we have an orange, neutral gray, neutral blue, and blue, all made with our burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and white. So now I'm no longer going to use white, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix a orange glaze. And the first glaze I'm going to do, right, so I'm going to move this to the side so you can see me mix. I'm going to take a bunch of medium. So it looks white, but it will dry clear. Okay. And I'm going to take the tiniest little bit on my brush of burnt sienna. And I'm going to thoroughly mix it together on my palette until it looks tinted. Okay, and I need it evenly mixed because you want it to be consistent. And then I'm going to do it over here so you can just see what that looks like. Right? It's very, very light. The more burnt sienna you use, if I add a tiny bit more burnt sienna, you'll see a little bit goes a long way. You would see more pigment. You don't want your glazes to have that much pigment. You can add as many glazes once they dry. Glaze over glaze over glaze over glaze. Like that's how the old masters painted. They did their, monochromatic earth tone painting, and then they would put glazes and glazes and glazes over them to colorize it and then go over it with opaque. So I'm going to go ahead and thin out my glaze so that it's not as much. Okay, so it looks like this now. It's kind of in between the two. And I'm going to then do a vertical stripe over all my colors so I can see how this color glaze will affect all of my colors here. So if I kind of zoom in, you can see a little bit, there's a shift. You'll see it when you're doing it even more for the sake of this visual, I will use now the one that I created with more and put it over so you can maybe see from the camera that there's more of a shift in now hue. All of my colors are going to be a little bit warmer. Whoop, wrong way. A little bit warmer and a little bit darker because there's no white in my glaze. Okay, now I'm going to create another orange glaze, but this time I'm going to put a little bit of orange and I'm going to grab a bunch of water so that you can see and remember that you can do this with water or acrylic. This is a painter's choice, which one you're going to do, which one you would do. And so I made it a little thicker so you can see it from the camera. So this is a water glaze. You have a little less control over it, but you'll see, especially when it dries, it has a little bit of consistency. You'll definitely feel the difference when you are painting. All right, so next, what we're going to do is create a neutral glaze, a black glaze. So to these mixtures over here already, I'm going to add a little bit more of my medium. And then I'm going to add a little bit of my blue until it looks grayish to me. Right? Make sure you don't want a messy glaze. So you got to make sure everything on your brush is mixing. Right? And so what does that look like? That would look like this. Right? Gray. Even though there's no white. It looks gray because you're seeing the white of the page through. So then I'm going to go ahead and paint my gray neutral glaze over all of these colors. Okay, so you can see it made them all a little darker and all a little more neutral. Look at that orange and the blue. You really see the difference there. So now I'm going to go ahead and wipe off my brush, and to my watery mixture over here, I'm going to add a little bit of blue till I get what I think looks black. I'm going to add more water. All right, so you can see what that looks like. Right? Maybe that's a little too, I'm going to add a little more burnt sienna so it's a little more neutral. All right, and I'll do my watery neutral here. You can see what that looks like. Right, same color, just has a little bit different. You don't want texture, but you'll see. It's a little faster. And then we're going to do the same thing with blue. So we're going to take some medium and just add a little blue. I'm going to do it again. I had a little bit of burnt sienna in my brush, so it was making it neutral blue instead of a more saturated blue. Okay, so I'm going to take my medium again. My blue. You notice that the blue is so much stronger. It really changes it. Look how thick. That's way too thick for a glaze. So I'm going to remix it over here. See what that looks like. See, that's a thick glaze. I would never want that. Because the whole point of the glaze is so you don't, lose all that work you did underneath. So if you make the glaze too thick, it's not mixing evenly. So do you see how you get these weird bands in it? Means there's some blue stuck in my brush. There we go. Okay, so there's my blue glaze. And then I'm going to do one last one with water. Wipe my brush. It's a watery blue. So keep in mind, you need a lot less blue than you need burnt sienna because it's so strong of a pigment comparatively. All right, so you kind of see how those change the original colors, make them cooler, and your warms are going to get darker. So this one is, these are both burnt sienna, but this one is medium and this one was water, right? This is your burnt sienna plus blue, these two, right? But this one has medium. This one has water. And then here we have our blue, but this one had medium and this one had water, right? So what are glazes good for? Let's see if I can write on top, right? We cannot create texture. You're not creating texture. But you can soften edges between because you're making them more similar. So soften, it's not quite dry, edges. And then you can also, that means create color transitions. It's just in a different way than you're blending in scumbling. So once you shouldn't ever end in glazing. You glaze, you let it dry, or you can work on it wet if you don't, it really just depends on your aesthetic. Um, then you can work on, you should then work on top of it again with opaque paint in the areas that need to brighten or lighten at that point or create more detail. And then that'll push the glazed part back a little bit and make it harmonious in terms of the rest of the painting.